He offered his jacket to a shivering woman at the bus stop, not knowing she was a CEO who would change his life forever. The wind cut through New York like a blade, snow falling steady from the gray sky, blanketing the sidewalks and quieting the city's usual roar. At a nearly deserted bus stop under a flickering street lamp, Henry stood hunched in a fraying olive jacket, clutching a worn manila folder tight to his chest. Inside were 5 resumes, 5 silent rejections. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog in the cold night air. His fingers, red and stiff, clutched a worn manila folder against his chest as if it contained treasure rather than rejection. Inside were 5 resumes, 5 polite dismissals, 5 more doors closed in his face. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath crystallize in the bitter night air, then disappear, much like his hopes had over these past 18 months. 46 years old, former structural engineer, widower, father, and for now, homeless. The thought landed heavily on him, more crushing than the snow accumulating on his shoulders. The weight of that word, homeless, still felt foreign on his tongue, though the reality of it had become his daily companion. The red glow of a nearby pharmacy sign blinked 8:41 p.m. The bus was late, as if even public transportation had decided he wasn't worth showing up for. Cold had long since soaked through his worn boots, his toes now numb pins and needles against wet socks. Henry shifted his weight, feeling the emptiness of his stomach growl in protest. He'd given his last $5 to the shelter fund earlier, a gesture that seemed foolish now as the temperature continued to drop. Then, through the curtain of snow, a woman appeared. She looked to be in her early 30s, dressed in an elegant business skirt and cream blouse. No coat, no scarf, nothing to shield her from the biting cold. Her heels clicked purposefully on the pavement, the sound of someone accustomed to being heard. Wet hair clung to her face, and her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she shivered visibly. She stopped beneath the same awning, her breath coming in short, visible puffs, hands trembling as she checked her phone. Henry tried not to stare, but her presence was striking, clean, polished, confident despite her obvious discomfort. Everything he no longer was. She rubbed her bare hands together, the diamond on her finger catching the streetlight as she failed to generate any warmth. Henry looked away. Just another night, just another bus to nowhere. This wasn't his problem. He had enough of his own. But then the wind howled with renewed vengeance. She flinched, curled inward, her shoulders hunching in a gesture so vulnerable it pierced through Henry's practiced indifference. He glanced at her again, seeing not wealth or status, but simply another human being suffering in the cold. His jacket wasn't much, threadbare at the elbows, zipper permanently stuck halfway. But it was something. It was, in fact, everything he had left that stood between him and the full brutality of winter. He could keep it, stay silent, be like everyone else who walked past the invisible. Self-preservation wasn't just smart. It was necessary. But he didn't. Without a word, Henry shrugged off his coat, the cold immediately biting into his bones through his thin flannel shirt. The folder of rejections tucked securely under his arm. He stepped toward her and held out the jacket, his hand steady despite the chill. Startled, she looked up, confusion crossing her features before understanding dawned. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice cultured, warm, uncertain. Henry gave her a tired smile, the kind that had seen too much disappointment to be anything but genuine. "I've already lost enough today," he said quietly. "This coat? It's the only thing I've left to give." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face for motive or madness. "But you need it more than I do." Still, he gently draped it over her shoulders, his calloused fingers brushing against the silk of her blouse for just a moment. "Not tonight." The warmth startled her, as if kindness itself had become unfamiliar. The jacket smelled faintly of soap and perhaps coffee, simple comforts that seemed suddenly profound. She pulled it tighter without meaning to, wrapping herself in the unexpected gift of a stranger's compassion. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate against the magnitude of what had just transpired between them. He nodded, folding his arms across his chest to keep what little warmth remained. They stood in silence as the snow continued to fall around them. Two strangers connected by nothing more than a moment of humanity in an indifferent city. After a moment, she turned to him. "What's your name?" "Henry." Just that. No last name, no title, no history. Just the essence of who he was. "I'm Clare." No last name either, as if in this moment, titles and positions didn't matter. "Nice to meet you, Clare." She glanced at him, taking in his worn jeans, the folder he clutched, the way he tried to hide his shivering. "You shouldn't have given me your jacket." He smiled faintly, genuine despite the cold seeping into his bones. "Probably not, but I couldn't just let you freeze." The low rumble of an approaching bus broke the silence. Headlights pierced through the snow as it pulled up to the curb, doors hissing open in invitation. Claire moved toward it, then turned back, something unresolved in her expression. "Do you have somewhere to go?" The question was tentative, crossing an invisible boundary. Henry shrugged, a gesture meant to be casual, but betrayed by the tension in his shoulders. "Somewhere," he said, not explaining that somewhere was the back seat of a rusted truck behind a warehouse, where a pile of blankets and memories served as both bed and home. She reached into her purse and handed him a card, the paper thick and expensive between his rough fingers. "In case you ever need anything." He took it, slipping it into his folder without looking. He didn't expect to use it. People said things like that all the time. Most didn't mean it. Kind words cost nothing and committed to even less. Claire stepped onto the bus, glanced back once more, the coat wrapped around her like armor against more than just the cold. Henry watched until the bus disappeared into the swirling snow, its taillights fading like dying embers. Alone again, he stood shivering, not just from the cold, but from something else. Something small, quiet, powerful. A feeling he'd almost forgotten existed. He looked up at the sky, then down at the empty street, the card in his folder suddenly heavier than it should be. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered, then turned and walked into the night, shoulders back despite the cold, as if he'd gained something in the moment he'd given everything away. Henry walked slowly through the quiet back streets, snow crunching beneath his worn shoes. There was no need to hurry, no one waiting, no lights left on in a window, just the cold familiarity of his truck parked behind an old warehouse on the edge of the city. The wind had picked up, cutting through his thin flannel shirt like it wasn't even there, but he barely noticed anymore. Physical discomfort had become such a constant companion that acknowledging it seemed redundant. He reached the truck just after 9. The old '98 Chevy was rusted along the wheel wells, the blue paint faded to a dull gray in patches, the heater long dead. To anyone passing by, it might have looked abandoned, just another piece of urban debris. But to Henry, it was everything he had left. Inside, the front seat was a carefully arranged nest of blankets, a pillow tucked in the corner, and a small lunchbox beneath the dashboard containing what remained of his dignity. A toothbrush, a bar of soap, a razor he used sparingly to maintain the appearance of someone who hadn't lost everything. The back seat held 2 cardboard boxes of clothes and books he couldn't bear to part with, each item a tether to the person he used to be. He climbed in, shut the door against the howling wind, and sat in silence, his fingers still numb from the cold. From the glove compartment, he pulled out a small tin box, the kind that once held mints. He opened it carefully, as if it contained something fragile and irreplaceable. Inside was a faded photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. His wife Lily smiled up at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that had always made his heart skip. Beside her stood their son Noah, about 7 in the picture, with a crooked grin that revealed a missing front tooth. They stood in front of their old house, the porch swing visible in the background, summer flowers blooming in planters Henry had built himself. "Good night, Lily," Henry whispered, his finger gently tracing her face. "Good night, Noah." He leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling of the truck, letting memories wash over him like waves. He had once been Henry Miles, structural engineer. He built things, schools, homes, hospitals, structures that would stand long after he was gone. He had a wife who taught kindergarten and laughed often, even when life was hard. Their son had her laugh, joyful and unfiltered. They weren't rich, but they were content, building a life one day at a time. Then the cancer came. By the time they found it, it was already stage 4. Lily was gone in 9 months, the disease consuming her so quickly that some days Henry felt he'd barely had time to say goodbye. He left his job to care for her, to make her final days as comfortable as possible. Afterward, everything unraveled with startling speed. Bills piled up, savings drained away. He sold the house, moved with Noah into smaller and smaller spaces until there was nothing left but the truck. Still, he tried to shield his son from the worst of it. He turned the back seat into a spaceship, canned soup into adventures, a parking lot into their backyard. Every morning, he walked Noah to school clean-shaven and with a shirt tucked in, maintaining the illusion that they were just going through a temporary rough patch. "Why do you still cut your hair?" a shelter worker had once asked, watching Henry carefully trim his beard in the community bathroom mirror. Henry had smiled slightly, not looking away from his reflection. "Because my son needs to believe things can get better, and I need to look like I believe that too." He worked whatever jobs he could find, moving furniture, fixing gutters, sweeping construction sites. It wasn't enough, but kept them together until last fall. A social worker stepped in, clipboard in hand and sympathy in her eyes that didn't quite mask the judgment. Said it wasn't safe. Said Noah needed stability. Henry didn't argue. He knew they were right. Through blurry eyes, he signed the papers, hugged his son tight enough to memorize the feeling, and promised, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been a climb up a mountain that seemed to grow steeper with each step. He sent resumes, stood in job fair lines with younger men who hadn't yet acquired the invisible mark of failure, took notes at free workshops, studied updated building codes at the library. He was building a plan, slowly, quietly, methodically, the way he'd once designed foundations that could withstand earthquakes. Tonight had made that plan feel further away than ever. Sitting in his cold truck, rubbing his arms for warmth, he thought of Clare, the woman at the bus stop. How cold she'd looked, how surprised when he offered his coat. He didn't know why he'd done it. Maybe because she reminded him of Lily, or maybe he just needed to feel like he could still do something good, that he was still the man who gave more than he took. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in a blanket that made everything look cleaner, newer than it really was. Henry pulled a blanket over himself, leaned against the cold window, and shut his eyes. He didn't have much, but he still had himself, and for now, that would have to be enough. Claire stepped into the sleek lobby of her apartment building, the warmth inside wrapping around her like a cashmere blanket. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod, but she barely acknowledged him, her mind still at the bus stop with the stranger who had given her his coat. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator, still wrapped tightly in the jacket the man, Henry, he'd said, had insisted she take. She hadn't intended to accept it. In fact, she had tried to refuse, but there had been something in his eyes that quieted any further protest, a dignity that transcended his circumstances. Now the jacket hung awkwardly on her frame, too large and threadbare, but somehow warmer than anything she had worn in years. It smelled of cold air and faint aftershave, and something else she couldn't quite place, perhaps resilience. She stepped into her penthouse apartment on the 28th floor and was immediately greeted by silence. No television, no music, no laughter, just the hum of modern appliances and the distant howl of winter wind through thick glass windows. The space was immaculate. White furniture, glass tables, abstract art selected by an interior designer whose name she could barely remember. Claire dropped her purse on the entryway table and slowly peeled off the jacket. She was about to set it aside when her fingers brushed against something in the inner pocket. Curious, she reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn, creased at the corners, smudged with fingerprints and time. She unfolded it carefully, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. It was a child's drawing done in crayon. Two stick figures stood hand in hand under a crooked sun. One was labeled Dad, the other me. A small heart floated between them. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "I love you, Daddy. Noah." Claire stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. She stared at the drawing, the words blurring before her eyes. A tremor ran through her, and she sank onto the edge of her couch, jacket still in one hand, the picture in the other, her throat tightening with each passing second. Noah. The name stuck in her mind like a thorn. The way Henry had held that folder, the tiredness in his eyes, the weight in his voice, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a man who had given her his coat. This was a father who still carried a piece of his child close to his heart. A father who had nothing, yet still chose to give. She looked around her apartment, seeing it suddenly through new eyes. The place was immaculate, yes, but also sterile. High ceilings, designer furniture, glass walls. Not a single photo frame or personal touch. A space designed for success, not warmth. A showcase, not a home. Claire folded the drawing gently and placed it on her lap. Then, without thinking, she pulled the coat close and hugged it tightly to her chest. It still smelled faintly of something familiar. Maybe laundry detergent, maybe memory. And suddenly, without warning, tears welled up in her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. Not really. Not since she was a little girl, cold and hungry, sitting on the steps of her church, hoping someone would notice her. That night, someone had, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face. He had taken off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He hadn't said much, just smiled and told her she'd be okay. It had been the first act of kindness she remembered, the first time she felt seen. She never saw the man again, but that moment changed everything. Claire sniffed and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. She wasn't the same girl anymore. She had clawed her way out of the foster system, worked through college on scholarships and sheer determination, built Infinity Group from a single app idea to one of the most influential tech companies on the East Coast. She had earned every dollar, every accolade, every square foot of this pristine apartment. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten what it meant to need, what it meant to give. Tonight, a stranger had reminded her. She looked again at the drawing, at the shaky little heart between the stick figures, then at the coat in her arms. Too big, too worn, but heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Langston cried. Not because she was broken, but because something inside her had been gently, beautifully cracked open. The next morning, Claire sat at her desk, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. The Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, sunlight glinting off glass and steel, a testament to human ambition and engineering. But her eyes were fixed on the crumpled drawing in her hand, the childish crayon strokes, somehow more impressive than the architectural marvels outside. The edges were worn now from being unfolded and folded again throughout the sleepless night, as if she were trying to memorize every stroke, every color choice, every bit of pressure applied by small hands. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the bus stop encounter on an endless loop, the way Henry had offered his only coat without hesitation, the quiet dignity in his voice, the pain behind his tired smile that he tried so hard to conceal. Something about him haunted her, not just the kindness, but the sorrow he carried, a weight she recognized despite having never experienced it herself. In a world where every interaction seemed calculated for maximum return, his simple act of humanity felt almost jarring in its purity. Claire reached into the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a small silver bell, an antique piece she'd found in London years ago. Its ring was clear and commanding, unlike the digital intercoms most executives preferred. Moments later, her assistant Rachel stepped in, tablet in hand, ready for the day's directives. "Yes, Miss Langston, I need you to help me find someone," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. She set the drawing face down on her desk, suddenly protective of it. Rachel blinked, her professional composure momentarily slipping. "Of course. Who?" Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, suddenly aware of how strange her request might sound. "His name is Henry. I don't have a last name. He was at the 56th and Madison bus stop last night around 8:30. She touched the edge of the jacket, draped over her chair. "He gave me his coat. I want to find him." Rachel looked surprised, but nodded, her fingers already tapping notes in her tablet. I'll see what I can do. Do you have any other information? Physical description? Where he might work? Claire shook her head. Just that he's middle-aged, probably in his 40s. Spoke like an educated man. She paused, considering what else to share. And I believe he has a son named Noah. I understand. Anything else? And Rachel, Claire added, her voice softening slightly. This stays between us. No team emails, no project codes, no digital trail. Just you and whoever you absolutely need to involve. Rachel studied her boss's face, clearly curious but professional enough not to ask questions. Of course, Miss Langston. I'll be discreet. Over the next few days, Claire's instructions were carried out with quiet efficiency. Her team, used to locating elusive developers and researching potential acquisition targets, now turned their skills toward piecing together the life of a man who lived in the shadows of the city they all navigated so confidently. They pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest intersections. Henry's figure appeared briefly, blurred and bundled in his jacket, then without it. They traced the bus routes that stopped in that area around the time Claire boarded. Cross-referenced with shelter entry logs, they narrowed down a handful of potential matches. None of them appeared in corporate databases or social media searches. While waiting for results, Claire found herself distracted in meetings, her mind wandering to the man in the cold. She caught herself staring at the coat hanging in her office closet, wondering how many winters it had seen, how many storms it had weathered alongside its owner. Finally, on the third day, Rachel returned with a thin folder, actual paper, not a digital file, honoring Claire's request for discretion. His name is Henry Miles, she said, placing the folder on Claire's desk. He used to be a structural engineer with Peterson and Associates until about 2 years ago. No recent employment records, though I found some online forum posts asking about job openings in construction. He listed a contact number linked to a prepaid phone. She hesitated. No permanent address that we could find. Claire flipped through the pages slowly. A copy of an old driver's license photo showed a different Henry, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, eyes bright with purpose. A LinkedIn profile frozen in time, last updated 26 months ago. A scan of a construction license that had expired last year. What happened to him? Claire asked, more to herself than to Rachel. His wife died of cancer, Rachel said softly. Lily Miles, 44. There were some local news articles about a fundraiser for her treatment, but it seems they ran out of money before she ran out of time. After that, the trail gets spotty. Tax records show he sold their house. There's a son mentioned in her obituary. Noah Miles, who would be about 19 now. Claire closed the folder, her throat suddenly tight. The silence in the room felt heavy with the weight of a stranger's tragedy. Where's he now? Rachel shifted her weight slightly. One of our security contractors spotted him yesterday near the south end of the Bronx. There's an old pickup truck parked behind a warehouse on Westchester Avenue. He's been seen coming and going, sleeping in it. We believe that's where he's staying. Claire stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady. I want to go there. Rachel hesitated, concern crossing her features. Claire, are you sure? We could arrange for someone to approach him, or bring him here if you prefer. That area isn't exactly. No, Claire interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. This isn't a business meeting or a recruitment effort. It's personal. She picked up the jacket from the back of her chair. I'll have someone drive me. Rachel studied her boss's face for a moment, then nodded slightly. I'll have Marcus bring the car around. He's ex-military, very discreet. I'll tell him it's a personal matter. An hour later, Claire sat in the back seat of a black sedan as it wound its way through streets far removed from boardrooms and glass towers. They passed shuttered storefronts, graffiti-covered walls, and people who moved with heads down against the cold, shoulders hunched as if carrying invisible burdens. The snow from the previous night had turned to gray slush here, pushed into dirty piles along the curbs. The driver, Marcus, a broad-shouldered man who asked no questions, pulled up near the warehouse Rachel had identified. That's the vehicle there, ma'am, he said quietly, nodding toward an old Chevy tucked into the shadows between the building and a chain-link fence. Snow piled up around its tires. It looked like it hadn't moved in days. "Thank you," Claire said. "Please wait here." She stepped out into the chill, the air smelling of rust and damp concrete. Her heels, practical today, but still clearly expensive, crunched softly on the gravel as she walked slowly toward the truck. Through the windshield, she could just make out a figure in the front seat, head tilted back, as if sleeping. As she got closer, the door creaked open. Henry stepped out, blinking in the daylight, clearly startled by her approach. He looked at her with confusion at first, then recognition dawned. His expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: puzzlement, caution, then something like embarrassment as he became acutely aware of his surroundings. "Claire," he said, his voice rough with sleep and surprise. He stood straighter, a reflexive dignity asserting itself despite his circumstances. She offered a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, Henry." He looked down at himself, at his wrinkled clothes, the snow-dusted boots, the truck behind him with its nest of blankets visible through the window. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," she said simply, holding his gaze. He frowned, crossing his arms. "Why?" She hesitated, suddenly unsure how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. About the kind of person who gives his only coat to a stranger when he has nothing else to give." Henry gave a bitter laugh, looking away. "You didn't have to track me down for that. A thank you card would have done the job. Or you could have just kept the coat and called it even." "It's not about thanks," she said, her voice softening. "It's about not letting something good disappear without being seen." She paused, searching for the right words. "In my world, everything has a price tag. Everything's a transaction. What you did, it reminded me there's another way to live." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two people from different worlds, brought together by an unlikely act in a bitter wind. The distance between their lives seemed both vast and paper-thin in that moment. Henry finally exhaled, a cloud of vapor dissipating between them. "You came all this way just for that?" Claire nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then added, "And maybe something more?" The next time Claire saw Henry, he was bent over a stack of cinder blocks at a construction site on the edge of Queens. She had waited in her car for 20 minutes, watching from a distance as he moved steadily, silently, hauling, stacking, lifting in the biting cold with the quiet resolve of a man used to being overlooked. He wore a worn flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms despite the chill, and his breath puffed out in visible clouds as he worked. His hands were calloused, nails rimmed with dirt, but his movements were precise, efficient, purposeful, the muscle memory of a man who once built things that mattered. Well, he took his break and sat on a low wall with a plastic water bottle in hand. Claire stepped out of the car and walked toward him. Henry looked up and did a double take, nearly dropping the bottle. He stood quickly, brushing dust from his pants with hands that suddenly seemed uncertain what to do. "Claire," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Hi again." "Hi," she said, her smile small but genuine. She held out a cup of coffee she'd brought with her. "Thought you might like something warm." He took it hesitantly, his eyes searching hers for motives he couldn't quite discern. "You really didn't have to do this." "I know," she replied simply, "but I wanted to." They stood in awkward silence for a beat, the steam from the coffee curling between them like a question mark. "Would you come with me?" she finally asked. "Just for a bit. I'd like to show you something." Henry looked down at his work boots, then back at the foreman in the distance who was eyeing them with undisguised curiosity. "I've still got a few hours on shift. Need the pay." "I already spoke to him," Claire said, surprising herself with her own forwardness. "Told him you had an interview. He said you could make up the hours tomorrow." His eyebrows raised. "I don't have an interview." "You do now," she replied, a hint of her boardroom confidence returning. Henry let out a short laugh, more surprised than amused. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to read a contract written in fine print. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, let's see what this is about." They drove in silence, Henry glancing out the window occasionally, fidgeting with the cuff of his shirt, acutely conscious of his appearance. The dusty jeans, rough hands, the faint trace of sweat on his collar, next to Claire's polished perfection. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she gave no indication that it mattered. When they arrived at Infinity Group's downtown headquarters, Henry hesitated in the marble-floored lobby, eyeing the massive glass walls, the polished chrome, the endless buzz of people in suits and sleek dresses who moved with purposeful energy. "I don't belong here," he said under his breath, suddenly feeling every inch the imposter. Claire turned to him, her eyes surprisingly gentle. "Just come upstairs. Trust me." They entered a private conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline Henry had once helped build. Claire offered him a seat, then closed the door and sat across from him at the gleaming table. Henry cleared his throat, his calloused hands resting awkwardly on the polished surface. "So what's all this about?" "Returning the coat." Claire shook her head. "No, this isn't about the coat. I kept that. It's mine now." A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. Henry blinked. "Okay." She leaned forward, her posture shifting subtly from CEO to simply Claire. "I didn't come looking for you to thank you, Henry. I came because you made me remember something I forgot. A version of myself I had buried under years of boardrooms and deadlines and quarterly reports." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You reminded me that real change doesn't always start with innovation or strategy or market disruption. Sometimes it starts with kindness, with seeing someone when the rest of the world has looked away." Henry looked down at his hands, uncomfortable with her intensity. "Claire, I'm just a guy trying to survive. What happened at the bus stop, anyone would have done it. But they didn't," she said quietly. "That's exactly why I brought you here." She slid a folder across the table to him, this one crisp and new, embossed with the Infinity Group logo. Inside was a job proposal, a contract, details of a position Henry had never heard of, cultural and human values advisor. The salary figure made his breath catch. "What is this?" he asked, frowning as he flipped through the pages. "It's a new role, one I created after meeting you." Claire's voice was steady now, confident. "Someone who sits in on department decisions, training programs, development discussions, not to talk numbers or strategy, but people, values, compassion." She leaned forward. "You'd share your experiences, help shape the heart of this company, remind us what we're building for beyond profit margins." Henry laughed awkwardly, shaking his head. "Claire, look at me. I don't have a degree in psychology. I didn't graduate from Harvard Business School. I sleep in a truck." "You were an engineer," she countered. "I haven't built anything in years." "You built a moment I'll never forget," Claire said softly, her professional facade slipping just enough to reveal the woman who had cried holding a child's drawing. "That tells me more about what this company needs than any resume ever could." Henry sat alone on a bench outside the towering office building, the job proposal resting unopened in his lap. His fingers ran along the edges of the folder, tracing the embossed company logo, but his eyes stared unfocused at the busy street before him. Pedestrians hurried past in their tailored coats and polished shoes, inhabiting a world he had once belonged to but now felt as distant as another country. He couldn't do it. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Somewhere deep down, beneath layers of caution and disappointment, a spark of hope had ignited, faint but undeniable. But fear gripped him with familiar hands, the kind that whispered cruel things late at night when the truck grew cold and memories were his only company. "She's just being nice. This isn't real. You'll mess it up. You always do. They'll see through you in a week." The offer felt like a trap wrapped in kindness. And Henry, who had spent years learning to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true, couldn't shake the weight of doubt pressing against his chest. What did a CEO want with someone like him? What possible value could he bring to a company that created technology he barely understood? He didn't see Claire step out of the building and walk toward him until she sat beside him on the bench, her presence announced only by the faint scent of something expensive and the gentle rustle of her wool coat. "You haven't opened it," she said softly, nodding toward the folder. Henry gave a dry chuckle, embarrassed to be caught in his indecision. "Didn't think I needed to. I already know how this ends." Claire tilted her head slightly, studying his profile. "How's that?" Someone like me doesn't end up in a place like this. He gestured vaguely at the gleaming skyscraper behind them. You don't build a company like Infinity by hiring people who sleep in trucks and haul cinder blocks. That's not what I'm doing, isn't it? Henry turned to face her fully. I think you made me an offer out of pity, or guilt, or some kind of, I don't know, karmic balancing of the scales. And I appreciate it, I do. But I don't need charity. Is that what you think this is? There was no anger in her voice, just genuine curiosity. What else could it be? I think you're a good person who wants to do a good thing. But I don't belong in your world, Claire. And we both know it. Claire looked ahead for a moment, watching the stream of people flowing in and out of the building, all purpose and confidence and belonging. Then she stood, smoothing her skirt with a decisive gesture. Come with me, she said. Not a request, but not quite a command either. Claire, no suits, no meetings, no corporate speak. Just trust me for an hour. Against his better judgment, against the voice of self-preservation that had kept him functioning these past 2 years, Henry stood. They walked to her waiting car in silence, a careful foot of space between them. They drove for over 30 minutes, away from the city's shining towers and into a quieter part of town where the buildings grew shorter and the signs switched from English to Spanish and back again. Finally, they pulled up in front of a modest red brick building with a faded green awning. A painted wooden sign read, Thomas's Place, a safe space for every child. Henry followed Claire inside, curiosity temporarily overriding his caution. The walls were bright, covered in handprints, painted animals, and quotes about kindness written in childish script. The air smelled faintly of crayons and warm bread, with underlying notes of disinfectant and the unmistakable energy of children. Laughter echoed from down the hall, high, joyous, unfiltered. Claire led him past the community kitchen where volunteers prepared what looked like an afternoon snack, through a reading room with mismatched beanbags and overflowing bookshelves, into a wide playroom filled with secondhand toys and handmade posters. Kids of all ages were sprawled across the floor, building with blocks, reading comics, drawing with markers that had clearly seen better days. A few looked up as they entered, but most remained absorbed in their activities, secure in the safety of their space. This place, Claire said quietly, was named after the man who saved me. Henry looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time, not as a CEO or a stranger or someone from another world, but as a person with a story he hadn't expected. I grew up in foster homes, she continued, her voice steady but softer than he'd heard before. Bounced around. Some were kind, some weren't. One night when I was 12, after a particularly bad placement, I ran away. It was freezing, much like the night we met. I curled up outside a church, just waiting for morning, not even sure what I'd do then. She paused, her eyes tracking a young girl who was carefully building a tower of blocks, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. He found me, Claire said, an old man named Thomas. He gave me his coat, sat with me all night, didn't ask questions, just stayed. Made me feel human when I'd started to believe I wasn't. Henry didn't speak. He couldn't. I never saw him again, Claire continued. But that moment, it was like someone reached into the darkness and said, you matter. I built this place because of him, because every child deserves to know they matter, even when the world tells them otherwise. She turned to face Henry fully, her professional mask completely gone now. And last week, someone else gave me a coat. Didn't know who I was. Didn't ask for anything. Just gave. The weight of her words settled between them, heavy with meaning. You remind me of him, she said simply. Not because of what you gave me, but because of who you are, who you've remained despite everything life has thrown at you. They stood in silence, surrounded by the sounds of life and laughter. Henry's eyes wandered across the room, at the children playing, a volunteer tying a shoelace, a young boy reading aloud with too much energy. It felt warm, real, like something that mattered in a way that balance sheets and quarterly reports never could. Claire touched his arm gently. I don't need you to fit in a boardroom, Henry. I need you to remind people of this, of what it means to care when caring seems like a luxury, of how to see people, not just problems or assets or liabilities. Henry didn't respond, not with words. His eyes were wet now, moisture gathering at the corners. He looked down, trying to blink the tears away, but they came anyway, quiet, unguarded tears that spoke of relief more than sadness. And then he nodded, not for the job or the salary or the title, but because for the first time in years, he felt it. He was still needed, still useful, still human. Henry's first day at Infinity Group didn't start with fanfare. There was no welcome party, no press release, no company-wide email announcing his arrival. Just a quiet meeting in a small glass-walled room on the 5th floor with a few skeptical department heads and a stack of sticky notes Claire had provided. She had introduced him simply. "This is Henry Miles. He's here to help us build something more meaningful than just profit." The looks were polite but uncertain, sideways glances that assessed his off-the-rack suit, purchased the day before with an advance from Claire, and hands that couldn't quite hide their calluses. One executive checked his phone repeatedly. Another doodled in the corner of her notepad. The message was clear. They were humoring their CEO's latest project. But Henry didn't flinch. He began by sharing his story. Not the sob version, not the headline-grabbing kind, just pieces. Honest pieces. What it felt like to lose everything. To wake up in a freezing truck with frost on the inside of the windows. To walk into job interviews knowing your shoes had holes. To choose kindness anyway, because sometimes it's the only currency you have left. At first, they listened with cautious curiosity, the way people watch street performers, interested but ready to walk away. By the end of that first hour, they were leaning forward in their chairs. By the end of the week, they were bringing him coffee and asking questions that had nothing to do with business metrics. Henry had a way of speaking that didn't preach or perform. He asked questions that made people pause. When was the last time you really looked someone in the eye? Not to assess or evaluate, but just to see them. Do you know the name of the janitor who cleans this floor? What would you do if you saw someone crying in the break room? He didn't come in with charts or data or PowerPoint presentations. He came in with empathy and a perspective that had been notably absent in the gleaming hallways of success. Slowly a shift began. One by one, employees started seeking him out. First the interns, then junior developers, then department heads with titles longer than Henry's entire resume. Some came to talk about stress, others about burnout or ethical dilemmas, or the nagging feeling that their work didn't matter. A few came just to sit quietly during lunch, finding comfort in the presence of someone who didn't demand performance. Henry listened, and when he spoke, he didn't offer solutions wrapped in corporate jargon. He offered perspective. "You're not broken," he once told a young programmer who confessed he hadn't slept in 3 days trying to meet a deadline. "You're just tired. Being tired doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've cared for too long without someone caring back." That line ended up taped to office doors, printed on mugs, quoted in emails between team members. Not because it was revolutionary, but because it was true in a way that cut through the pretense that had accumulated like dust. Claire watched it all unfold from her corner office. She saw how break room chatter changed, how laughter returned to meetings, how productivity rose not because of pressure, but because people felt seen. Projects that had stalled for months suddenly found momentum, not through new processes, but through renewed purpose. It wasn't long before Henry had an official space of his own, small, cozy, filled with plants employees brought him and second-hand books he collected from thrift stores. His door was always open, and a coffee pot on his desk never seemed to empty. He kept no calendar, scheduled no meetings, yet somehow was exactly where he needed to be when someone needed him. Outside of work, life began to rebuild in quiet, meaningful ways. With Claire's help and a small housing stipend from the company, Henry was able to put a down payment on a modest one-bedroom house on the edge of Brooklyn. It wasn't much. The plumbing groaned, the floors creaked, and the previous owners had chosen a particularly aggressive shade of yellow for the kitchen. But it had a porch, a garden plot, and walls that didn't rattle in the wind. More importantly, it had room for Noah. Now in his first year at a local community college, Noah had moved back in with his father, bringing with him the resilience of youth and the quiet understanding of someone who had seen too much too soon. Their first dinner in the new house was simple: spaghetti and garlic bread on plates that didn't match, eaten at a table rescued from a curb and sanded down to something beautiful. But Henry would remember it for the rest of his life. "You kept your promise," Noah had said that night, his voice catching as he looked around at their small but undeniable home. Henry hadn't answered. He couldn't, not with words. But the look in his eyes said everything a father could ever hope to convey to his son. "I would move mountains for you. I would give away my last coat. I would never stop trying." As for Claire, she and Henry saw each other nearly every day. At first, it was about work, meetings, strategies, collaborations on new initiatives. Then, without trying, it became more. They started eating lunch together, then walking to the subway together. Then weekend coffees turned into evenings spent watching old movies, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. It just happened, the way important things often do, not with fireworks, but with the quiet recognition of something true. They were two people who had spent years building armor around themselves, only to find comfort in the quiet company of someone who didn't ask for anything but presence. One late afternoon, as they stood on the rooftop of the Infinity building watching the sunset paint the skyline in shades of amber and gold, Claire said softly, "You've changed this place, Henry." He chuckled, his shoulder brushing against hers. "No, I just reminded them what they already knew." She looked at him, the fading light catching in her eyes. "And reminded me, too." Henry had just finished a workshop on resilience when a young man lingered after everyone else had left. He looked no older than 22, skinny, pale, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and silent battles. He shifted from foot to foot, clutching his notebook like a shield. "I just wanted to say something," he said, voice shaking slightly. "Last month I was going to quit." Henry nodded, giving the young man space to continue. "Everything," the young man clarified, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Life, I mean. I was done. Had it all planned out." Henry felt his chest tighten, but kept his expression open, present. "But then I heard you speak at the company town hall, and something stopped me." The young man swallowed hard. "You said something about how people don't need to be fixed. They just need to be heard. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply exist when everything is telling you not to." He looked up, meeting Henry's eyes directly for the first time. No one had ever said that to me before. It felt like someone finally saw me. Not as a problem to solve or a project to manage, but just me. The young man's voice steadied as he continued. "If it weren't for you, I don't think I'd be here. Not at Infinity. Not anywhere." Henry stepped forward and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor beneath his palm. "I'm really glad you are," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. After the young man left, Henry sat down in his chair, the room suddenly quiet, the words echoing in his mind. He had once wondered if he'd ever matter again, if anything he did could have meaning after losing so much. Now, he had his answer. It wasn't in the salary that had allowed him to secure a home or in the title on his new business cards. It wasn't even in the grateful emails from employees or the metrics showing decreased turnover and increased engagement since his programs began. It was in this, in one life, continuing when it might have ended. In one person feeling seen when invisibility had become unbearable. Henry looked around his small office with its mismatched furniture and plants gifted by colleagues. On his desk sat a framed crayon drawing, Noah's artwork from years ago, now preserved behind glass. Beside, it was a newer edition, a photograph of Henry and Noah standing on the porch of their new home, arms around each other's shoulders, tentative smiles that held both history and hope. He traced the edge of the frame with his finger, remembering the night he'd given away his coat, how cold the walk back to his truck had been, how he'd questioned his own judgment. If he could go back to that moment, knowing where it would lead, he'd give the coat again in a heartbeat. Some sacrifices, he'd learned, weren't sacrifices at all, but investments in a future you couldn't yet imagine. The atrium of Infinity Group had never looked like this before. Gone were the banners celebrating quarterly achievements and product launches. In their place hung soft white drapes, strings of warm lights, and a massive sign that read in elegant lettering, "One Kindness Day." Employees stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their best, not for business, but for something far more meaningful. The usual hierarchies had dissolved for the evening. Interns chatted with vice presidents, security guards with software architects, all united by something that transcended organizational charts. On the center stage, Clare Langston stepped up to the podium, her eyes sweeping across the room. The crowd quieted instantly, not from obligation, but from genuine respect. "This day isn't about metrics," she began, her voice clear in the hushed space. "It's not about stock prices or market share or quarterly projections. It's about moments." She paused, letting the words settle. "A year ago, I was standing at a bus stop in the freezing cold, alone, tired, and more lost than I realized. And then a man whom I had never met did something no one else had that night. He gave me his coat." A murmur of recognition stirred through the crowd. The story had become something of a legend within the company, though few knew all the details. Claire smiled softly. It was old, worn, certainly not designer, but it was everything because it reminded me that kindness, real kindness, doesn't wait until it's convenient. It doesn't calculate return on investment. It shows up when the world least expects it. She turned to the easel beside her and removed the cloth draped over it. There, behind a glass frame, was the very same coat, frayed at the sleeves, faded from years of use, but preserved like something sacred. Beneath it, engraved on a bronze plaque, read the words, "One small act of kindness can rewrite a life." Claire's voice wavered slightly. "That act didn't just change my night. It changed the course of my life, the direction of this company, and hopefully the lives of everyone in this room." She looked around, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "And today we honor not just that moment, but the man who made it possible." She turned toward the edge of the stage. "Henry, will you come up here?" Henry stood slowly from his seat in the front row, dressed in a simple suit that fit him properly now. His face still carried the lines etched by time and hardship, but there was something lighter in his expression, something peaceful that hadn't been there a year ago. He made his way through the applause, up the steps to the stage, standing slightly to the side, as if still uncomfortable with attention. Claire reached in her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This belongs to you," she said, handing it to him. Henry opened it, confusion crossing his features. Inside was the title deed to his house, but now stamped paid in full across the mortgage information. Gasps echoed through the crowd as the document was displayed on the overhead screens. Claire leaned in with a smile. No more worrying about payments. No more sleeping in trucks. Ever. The room erupted in applause again, but Henry held up a hand. The crowd quieted immediately, a testament to the respect he'd earned. "I actually have something too," he said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled out a small box, simple, worn, clearly held onto for some time. He looked at Claire, heart pounding visibly in the pulse at his throat. "You said this coat changed your life, but you changed mine. Gave me back my name, my son, a roof, and hope when I'd forgotten what that felt like." He opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, not flashy or ostentatious, but shining quietly under the lights, a small diamond catching and reflecting the glow. "I kept it," he said, voice trembling slightly. "When I sold everything else, I kept this. It was my mother's. Because if there's anything more valuable than that coat, anything more worth protecting, it's the possibility that someday I might find someone to give it to." He took a breath, steadying himself. "Clare Langston, will you marry me?" A beat of stillness fell over the room. Then Claire laughed, a soft, choked, beautiful sound, and nodded through tears that gleamed in the spotlight. "Yes," she said. "Of course. Yes." The crowd rose in a standing ovation, cheers and claps bouncing off the high glass ceiling. But for Henry and Claire, the noise seemed to fade away, leaving only the space between them, a space once occupied by a coat given freely on a cold winter night. 1 month later, they were married. The wedding wasn't held in a grand ballroom or a five-star resort, as many had expected. It took place at Thomas's Place, the little red brick community center that meant the world to them both. Children made paper flowers and strung them from the ceiling. The chairs didn't match. The cake was baked by one of the interns from Henry's mentorship program. Her first attempt at a wedding cake, slightly lopsided but made with undeniable care. But the room glowed with something money couldn't buy, something that made even the wealthiest guests feel like they were witnessing something richer than they'd ever known. Claire wore a simple white dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. Henry wore that same suit, now familiar enough to feel like his own skin. Noah stood at his father's side as best man, his eyes bright with a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief at how much had changed. The guests were a tapestry of lives intersecting. Volunteers from the center, co-workers from every level of Infinity, people from shelters where Henry now ran weekly workshops, and dozens of young employees who had once sat in Henry's tiny office searching for purpose and found it in his quiet wisdom. During the vows, Claire held Henry's hands and looked into his eyes. "Once you gave me a coat," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Tonight, I give you my whole life." Her words fell over the room like sunlight through stained glass, soft, radiant, transforming everything they touched. Henry couldn't speak for a moment. He just nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks as the crowd around them dabbed at their eyes with tissues and handkerchiefs. When he found his voice, it was steady despite the emotion. "I promise to keep you warm," he said simply. "Not just with coats or houses or things that can be bought, but with love that chooses you every day, especially on the coldest nights." Laughter followed. Music played. The reception spilled out into the courtyard where children ran barefoot and strings of fairy lights danced in the twilight. Someone snapped a photo that would later go viral. Henry and Claire stood beneath the sign of Thomas's place, side by side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, and beside them on an easel stood the old coat, silent, worn, and now immortalized. That image would circulate online, shared and reposted and talked about in corners of the internet where cynicism typically reigned. A symbol not just of second chances, but of how something as simple as kindness could reach into the cold and rewrite everything. In the months that followed, Infinity Group launched a foundation dedicated to addressing homelessness through dignity-first approaches. Henry headed it, bringing both lived experience and newfound corporate influence to bear on a problem most preferred to ignore. Claire restructured company policies to include community service as paid work time, mentorship programs for at-risk youth, and family support systems that recognized employees as whole people, not just productive units. Noah graduated with honors and joined the foundation, bringing fresh ideas and the unique perspective of someone who had experienced both sides of fortune's coin. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a coat, a smile, a kind word, can echo further than we ever imagine. Henry didn't have much that night at the bus stop, but he gave what he could, and in return, he didn't just change Claire's life. He found love, purpose, and a new beginning that extended far beyond himself. Their story reminds us all that kindness doesn't require perfection, just presence, just heart. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that hope still lives in unexpected places, please like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here we tell the tales that warm the heart, restore your faith in humanity, and remind us what truly matters. The story of Henry and Claire didn't end with their wedding. In many ways, it was just beginning. The photograph from their ceremony, standing beneath the sign of Thomas's place with a framed coat beside them, became something of a symbol. It appeared first on Infinity Group's website, then in business journals discussing the company's remarkable transformation, and finally across social media, where it resonated with millions seeking evidence that compassion could still thrive in a world often dominated by self-interest. What made their story so compelling wasn't just the Cinderella-like elements, the homeless man and the CEO, but the authenticity that radiated from both of them. In interviews, Henry never portrayed himself as a saint or his actions as extraordinary. "I was just cold," he would say with a small smile, but not as cold as she was. Claire, for her part, never tried to position their story as a corporate marketing strategy. When business publications wanted to feature Infinity's humanitarian approach as a case study in brand building, She declined. Some things aren't meant to be leveraged, she told her marketing team. They're meant to be lived. Within a year of their marriage, the Henry Miles Foundation was established, operating independently, but with seed funding from Infinity Group. Its mission wasn't just to provide temporary shelter or meals, though it did that too, but to restore dignity to those who had lost everything except their humanity. The foundation hired people who had experienced homelessness themselves, valuing their insight above conventional credentials. It created pathways to employment that didn't require permanent addresses or perfect resumes. Most importantly, it approached each person not as a problem to be solved, but as a story still being written. Everyone has a chapter they don't read aloud, Henry often said during training sessions for new foundation staff. Our job isn't to pry those chapters open. It's to make sure there are many more chapters to come. Noah, now graduated and working alongside his father, brought technological innovation to the foundation's work. He developed an app that connected people in need with immediate resources, not just shelters and food banks, but also individuals in their immediate vicinity willing to offer a meal, a warm place to sit, or simply conversation without judgment. The app, called Next Chapter, quickly gained traction, first in New York, then in cities across the country. What made it unique wasn't just its functionality, but its underlying philosophy, that giving and receiving were equally valuable, equally dignified parts of the human experience. On cold nights, Claire would sometimes join Henry on the foundation's outreach van, passing out blankets and hot meals in the same neighborhoods where he had once sought refuge. She never mentioned her position or wealth, never wore anything that would create distance. She simply handed out soup, remembered names, and listened to stories that rarely found audiences. After one such night, as they drove home through streets still gleaming with rain, Claire reached for Henry's hand across the console of their modest car. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked quietly. "If you hadn't given me your coat that night." Henry was silent for a moment, watching the streetlights cast rhythmic patterns across the dashboard. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I think about Thomas, the man who helped you when you were a child. And I wonder how many other moments like that have shaped all of us, without us even knowing." "A chain of kindness," Claire murmured. "Something like that," Henry nodded. "We just happened to catch a glimpse of our link in the chain." Their story continued to unfold in ways neither could have predicted. Infinity Group became known not just for its technological innovations, but for its revolutionary approach to corporate culture. Employee retention soared. Productivity increased, not through pressure, but through purpose. Other companies began to take notice, sending representatives to learn from what the business press had dubbed the Infinity model. Claire would direct these visitors not to HR policies or mission statements, but to Henry's small office where the walls were covered with children's artwork, thank you notes, and photographs of employees' families. "This is where our success begins," she would say, "not in our strategic plan, but in our capacity to see each other." On the anniversary of their first meeting, Henry and Claire established a company-wide tradition, Coat Day. Employees brought new or gently used winter coats to the office, each with a handwritten note tucked into the pocket. Words of encouragement, small poems, or simply "You matter," written in careful script. The coats were then distributed throughout the city to those who needed them most. The first year, they collected 200 coats. The second year, 750. By the third year, over 3,000 coats made their way from Infinity Group to shoulders that had grown accustomed to bearing the weight of winter alone. But perhaps the most profound impact came in the quiet, unrecorded moments, when an Infinity employee stopped to help a stranger on the subway, when a foundation client returned as a volunteer, when Noah's app connected a retired teacher with a young woman who needed both a meal and someone who remembered her name. These moments didn't make headlines. They weren't captured in annual reports or metrics, but they rippled outward, touching lives that would never know the story of a coat given freely on a cold night. 5 years after they first met at that bus stop, Henry and Claire stood on the roof of the Infinity building, watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled over New York. Between them, holding each of their hands, was a small girl with Claire's eyes and Henry's gentle smile. Their daughter, Lily, named for the wife Henry had lost and the resilience he had found. "Tell me the story again," Lily asked, her voice carrying that particular insistence of 4-year-olds who have found a tale they love. Claire smiled at Henry over their daughter's head. "Which story, sweetheart?" "The one about the coat and the cold and how you found Daddy." Henry knelt down to his daughter's level, his knees protesting slightly, a reminder of nights spent on unforgiving surfaces. "Well," he began, "once upon a time, there was a very cold night and a very kind heart." As he spoke, painting the scene in simple words a child could understand, Claire watched them both. This man who had given everything when he had nothing, and this child who would grow up knowing that the most valuable things can't be kept, only given away. In that moment, with the city spread before them like a constellation of possibilities, Claire understood something profound, that sometimes the greatest journeys don't take us to new places, but to new ways of seeing the places we've always been. The coat that had started their story hung now in a simple frame in their home, not as a trophy or a reminder of hardship, but as a testament to the truth that even the smallest gestures of humanity can echo far beyond our imagination. That kindness, offered without expectation of return, has a power that no balance sheet can measure. And in a world that often seems designed to separate us by wealth, by status, by a circumstance, sometimes all it takes to bridge the distance is a single moment of recognition. One person seeing another, not for what they lack, but for who they are. One coat, one kindness, one life changed. Then another, a ripple becoming a wave, becoming a current that carries us all. Until next time, stay kind and keep believing.